Today we're going to talk about a single passage from the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, and it's section 295 of Beyond Good and Evil. It's in fact the second to last aphorism of the entire book. And we're going to do things a little differently today because before we talk about it, I'm just going to go ahead and read you the entire section. So, without further ado, Beyond Good and Evil, 295, quote, "The genius of the heart, as that great concealed one possesses it, the tempter god and born Pied Piper of consciences, whose voice knows how to descend into the netherworld of every soul, who does not say a word or cast a glance in which there is no consideration and ulterior enticement, whose mastery includes the knowledge of how to seem, not what he is, but what is to those who follow him one more constraint to press ever closer to him, in order to follow him more inwardly and thoroughly. The genius of the heart, who silences all that is loud and self-satisfied, teaching it to listen, who smooths rough souls and lets them taste a new desire, to lie still as a mirror, that the deep sky may mirror itself in them. The genius of the heart, who teaches the doltish and rash hand to hesitate and reach out more delicately, who guesses the concealed and forgotten treasure, the drop of graciousness and sweet spirituality under dim and thick ice, and is a divining rod for every grain of gold that has long laid buried in the dungeon of much mud and sand. The genius of the heart, from whose touch everyone walks away richer, not having received grace and surprised, not as blessed and oppressed by alien gods, but richer in himself, newer to himself than before, broken open, blown at and sounded out by a thawing wind, perhaps more unsure, tenderer, more fragile, more broken, but full of hopes that as yet have no name, full of new will and currents, full of new dissatisfaction and undertows. But what am I doing, my friends? Of whom am I speaking to you? Have I forgotten myself so far that I have not even told you his name? Unless you have guessed by yourselves who this questionable spirit and God is, who wants to be praised in such fashion. For just as happens to everyone who from childhood has always been on his way and in foreign parts, many strange and not undangerous spirits have crossed my path too, but above all, he of whom I was speaking just now, and he again and again, namely, no less a one than the god Dionysus, that great ambiguous one and tempter god, to whom I once offered, as you know, in all secrecy and reverence, my firstborn, as the last, it seems to me, who offered him a sacrifice, for I have found no one who understood what I was doing then. Meanwhile, I have learned much, all too much, more about the philosophy of this god, and, as I said, from mouth to mouth, I, the last disciple and initiate of the god Dionysus, and I suppose I might begin at long last to offer you, my friends, a few tastes of this philosophy, insofar as this is permitted to me, in an undertone, as is fair, for it concerns much that is secret, new, strange, odd, uncanny. Even that Dionysus is a philosopher, and that gods, too, thus do philosophy, seems to me to be a novelty that is far from innocuous, and might arouse suspicion, precisely among philosophers. Among you, my friends, it will not seem so offensive, unless it comes too late and not at the right moment, for today, as I have been told, you no longer like to believe in God and gods. Perhaps I shall also have to carry frankness further in my tale than will always be pleasing to the strict habits of your ears. Certainly the god in question went further, very much further, in dialogues of this sort, and was always many steps ahead of me. Indeed, if it were permitted to follow human custom in according to him many solemn pomp and virtue names, I should have to give abundant praise to his explorer and discoverer courage, his daring honesty, truthfulness, and love of wisdom. but such a God has no use whatever for all such venerable junk and pomp. Keep that, he would say, for yourself and your likes and whoever else has need of it. I have no reason for covering my nakedness. One guesses. This type of deity and philosopher is perhaps lacking in shame. Thus he once said, "Under certain circumstances I love what is human," and with this he alluded to Ariadne, who was present. Man is to my mind an agreeable, courageous, inventive animal that has no equal on earth. It finds its way in any labyrinth. I am well disposed towards him. I often reflect how I might yet advance him and make him stronger, more evil, and more profound than he is. Stronger, evil, and more profound, I asked, startled. Yes, he said once more, stronger, more evil, and more profound, also more beautiful. And at that the tempter god smiled with his halcyon smile, as though he had just paid an enchanting compliment. Here we also see what this divinity lacks is not only a sense of shame, and there are also other good reasons for conjecturing that in several respects all of the gods could learn from us humans. We humans are more humane. End quote. So this passage is captivating to me on so many levels. First and foremost, because it's Nietzsche speaking in overtly religious metaphors to describe what can only be called a religious sort of devotion to a deity. He calls himself the last initiate and disciple of Dionysus. So, of course, it's not devotion to a Christian deity. Dionysus is a deity of the ancient Greeks who were the most profound influence on Nietzsche's thought and life. And in particular, Dionysus is the most influential of all the Greek gods on Nietzsche. He fascinated him the most, and it was the god that Nietzsche wrote about the most. And so he says outright that there is no mystery about the prose poem, which takes up approximately the first half of the section, the way I look at the passage anyway. The genius of the heart is Dionysus, whom Nietzsche says is among those strange and not undangerous spirits. In other words, dangerous, right? And so Dionysus is a dangerous spirit that he's crossed paths with throughout his life many times, again and again, he says. It's a reoccurring encounter with something within him. So the centrality of Dionysus to Nietzsche's philosophy is widely known. I mean, he is, in some sense, part of the central metaphor, I would say, for understanding Nietzsche's work, especially his later work, the central point of contrast, which is between Dionysus and the crucified, the way Nietzsche talks about it in Ecce Homo, and to some extent in other passages as well. But here Nietzsche almost abandons all the philosophical trappings of his work, in which Dionysus can be safely regarded as a metaphor, right? As a conceptual metaphor. But here Nietzsche is using the language of poetry. And he treats Dionysus within that poetic language, lyrical sort of language, as a real personified figure. And even in his explanation of the poem, Nietzsche continues to speak of Dionysus in this way. I wouldn't say it's an explanation of a poem. Maybe it's his commentary on his own poem, almost, right? But he recounts his encounter with the deity, or in exchange, he has dialogue between himself and Dionysus, as though he were relating a scene out of a myth. And so now, of course, for the broader interpretation of Nietzsche's work, you can continue to safely classify Dionysus in the realm of metaphor. But for the sake of flexing our muscles of imagination this week, let's regard Dionysus as a real being that Nietzsche is paying homage to. And we'll kind of get into what that means, but I think on some level, let's go into this agnostically. I mean, Nietzsche often said the deepest, most profound insights will be incommunicable. They cannot even be put into language. The truths of our deepest instincts and our most personal virtues will always remain unknowable to all but ourselves. Maybe unknown even to ourselves as well, right? And so, and then furthermore, like abolishing metaphysics, as Nietzsche dared to do in his later work, abolishing the pursuit of finding a true world beyond the senses. it means that you put such questions about maybe the epistemology behind what Nietzsche is positing here about Dionysus, right? The sorts of philosophical questions we might want to raise. I mean, to invoke Wittgenstein again, as I've kind of brought Wittgenstein up quite frequently of late, Wittgenstein famously held that of which we cannot speak, one must remain silent, and that which can be said clearly. And Wittgenstein himself was no stranger to poetry, even some apparently spiritual or even mystical sorts of belief. It's just that he didn't believe that philosophy could ever really deal with that sphere of human life. Which is all sort of a roundabout way of saying that that's what we're talking about here. I think we're talking about something that Nietzsche only dares to put into words in the form of poetry. He scatters references to Dionysus throughout his work as a philosophical concept, but when he's here speaking about Dionysus as a god to which he is the last initiate, I'm saying let's take a step back and consider maybe Nietzsche is talking about something that's very deep and personal here that we can't exactly put into a box. I don't want to put it into the box that he's necessarily is invoking a literal deity, a literal personified deity that he believes exists, quote unquote, out there in the true world, because as I've said, I don't think Nietzsche believes in that kind of philosophical supposition about the true world beyond the senses. On the other hand, I think we should read the passage at face value for what he's saying and not necessarily put it into the idea that this is just a conceptual box that he's using to talk about the ancient Greek morality or something like that. That there is a deeper connection with Dionysus that's maybe not the kind of thing that could be philosophically argued in his broader work. And so we're going to set Nietzsche's materialism and his naturalism and his cynical attitude about religious claims, which I have stressed throughout the podcast, are very key to understanding Nietzsche's philosophy. But let's consider that he's free to conjure up a concept such as Dionysus as a literal god, this genius of the heart, the tempter and enticer of mankind, in a less rigorous, more lyrical way. And now, Dionysus obviously existed as a deity thousands of years ago in ancient Greece. But there's no one around anymore who worships Dionysus. There's no Dionysian religious tradition. And so our knowledge of it comes strictly from books. It exists purely within the imagination. We do not really have a direct experience with the Dionysian religion. I'll put it like that. And so, insofar as Nietzsche considers himself the last initiate of Dionysus, he's in effect creating one. He's creating an image of Dionysus, which is coming out of the raw material of himself, is in some sense a reflection of himself, some qualities in himself that he's wished to spiritualize. Maybe even making that statement gets a little too much into materialism and psychologizing again, which I don't want to do too much. And part of that, again, is because I think a lot of those points are rather obvious. So let's go beyond truth and skepticism and consider the sentiments in this poem as, ironically, it's a sort of paean to Dionysus. Now, a paean was a type of poem used for eulogizing a god or a great person. Typically, we talk about eulogies in modern life as a thing you say at a funeral, but back in the day, it was just a tribute to a person and their virtues. Usually it spoke of their noble origin or their great deeds. Typically, it's an Apollinian style of poetry, so it would be practiced in honor of the god Apollo himself, or at festivals honoring him, or even on the battlefield. On the other hand, this poem of Nietzsche's, this prose poem, it has no rhyme scheme. It's a relatively free rhythm. So maybe there's a dithyrambic or Dionysian element to the composition as well, obviously. The lines are free-flowing, one following the other naturally as by a correspondence or association. So, the paean was traditionally an Apollinian style of poetry. The dithyramb was the Dionysian style of poetry. Here we have elements of both, which is quite fitting, actually. And so in any case, Nietzsche waxes poetic about a god or a genius, a spirit, and as I never tire of emphasizing, genie, genius, common etymological root. It's when we use the term genius today, we typically are speaking of like a person. You'll say you're a genius, right? In the older use of the word, genius was the thing that grips the person, right? And so to say someone was a genius is to say that they're inhabited or possessed by genius. And it must be said in the case of the ancient poets, they understood that they were inhabited by a god or a muse, by a spirit that came and dwelt within the poet and moved him to express his verses as though the poetic material literally comes from another plane of existence. And so this influence of the god within the poet is what produces the poetry, but that it doesn't end there. It radiates out further when the poem is then performed by a rhapsode, because traditionally in ancient Greece, you had one person write the poetry, who was the poet, and then rhapsode was the person who performed it. The rhapsode then transmits on another level, another link in the chain, the divine influence of the god, the divine madness of the god, into the audience. And then the audience then carry around the influence of the god in their own hearts. And so it's the ancient view of art, particularly of poetry, dramatic poetry, as understood by people like Socrates and Plato, was that it was quite literally a spirit possession. And that even because, these spirits are gods, they can dwell in multiple people, right? And that it's almost like the aura of the god can sort of radiate out from the poet to the rhapsode to the audience. And maybe it gets a little fainter with each person it transmits through. But it carries on. The spirit inhabits multiple people. So that's the kind of understanding of poetry of the ancient philosophers that Nietzsche would have been familiar with. And so on one level, we can understand Dionysus as the god or spirit that has seized Nietzsche and now dwells in his heart, and he can feel Dionysus within him. And so that's where the poem is coming from. Also, the poem is called The Genius of the Heart, and he's describing this individual, this figure, who sort of does a similar thing. He transmits his spirit into others and stirs something in them. And so we get the impression that maybe that's not only what's happening to Nietzsche, but he's describing that in the poem. And the third level is that this is sort of an image of what Nietzsche wants to be or embody. Again, we could take a psychological angle or a psychological view of this and say that what Nietzsche is possessed by is a feeling or a drive or a sub-personality, like a bundle of drives, maybe a complex, right, as the early psychoanalysts would have called it. And I mean, people still use the term complex today. But I think very rarely do people think about where that comes from, right? It's a complex because it's a collection of various drives forming a sort of sub-personality. So Nietzsche finds this beautiful and terrifying divine figure dominating his attention, demanding a confrontation with the conscious personality. And so, on the psychological level, that's what he's expressing. But on the quite literal level, I mean, what must a mortal do when confronted with a god, right? You have to appease the god, and so that's what Nietzsche's doing by offering these verses. We may say this is Nietzsche trying to understand himself, to give a name to the great longing that he finds in his soul, and to put that name into the language of the ancients, with whom he found so much kinship, to spiritualize the passions within him. And that is, I think, longing, if we'll remember from the talks we did about the Übermensch, is a very central feeling that Nietzsche wants to spiritualize. And that does seem to be, throughout these verses, a lot of what he's talking about here, kindling longing within others. But this task that he set for himself runs up against that same opposition we mentioned of Dionysus versus the crucified. And that's part of why this passage is a great subject for a whole talk about Nietzsche, because it, in that way, touches it touches at the heart of many of the issues underlying what Nietzsche's trying to do philosophically, because it's longing in a worldly sense is a very anti-Christian feeling. And it cuts against the, what would you say, the redemptive narrative of many of the major world religions, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, that there's nothing of value in this world, right? We're in a burning house. Everything eventually falls apart and goes away. Eventually you will die. And so there's nothing to look forward to in this life. Your hopes should be directed to that which is after death, right? So longing for things in this world is not really acceptable. I mean, you can long for the communion with God in heaven, right? That kind of longing could be perhaps permitted, but that's not what Nietzsche's talking about. What he's really trying to kindle, especially with like the Übermensch idea, where he says we should all be willing to become arrows of longing for the overman, and constantly emphasizes the theme of going under, of letting what you are now die so that you can overcome what you are and be transformed into something greater. What he's talking about in that sense of longing, it completely cuts against the idea that you're fine the way you are now, or that you should be satisfied. You know, blessed are the meek, be satisfied with what you have. Blessed are the poor in spirit. That's sort of what's ordinary, average, humble, and all of that is it's blessed in the eyes of God, right? And that rejecting the world as it is now is actually a good thing, and it's a sign of holiness. Another way to tease this out is how we're all equal in the eyes of God. That, you know, in the end, you'll all be judged by the Lord, and no one is good enough to get into heaven, right? We all have to rely on the grace of God through either, you know, in Islam, submission to God. The case of Christianity, Jesus' sacrifice. In Buddhism, it's way more complicated. I won't get into that. But point being, there is no amount of striving or ambition, worldly ambition, that will ever be anything more than, you know, ashes to ashes, dust to dust in the end. And in the end, we're all equal in the eyes of the Lord, right? And so that's why this sort of longing that Nietzsche's talking about, I mean, really, if we want to put it in mundane terms, self-improvement. And he says it arises in Zarathustra, to make reference to this again, he says it arises out of your moment of great contempt. And this is sort of the dissatisfaction he alludes to at the end of the poem, of not learning to take satisfaction in what you have, but learning to be dissatisfied with what you have, so that you are willing to destroy what you have in order to create something better, create something beyond yourself. That's what Nietzsche's talking about. And so it's fundamentally opposed to the whole Christian orientation towards life. And so in order for Nietzsche to sort of expound his longing to all the hearts of mankind, he has to replace one set of images and ideals with another. He has to displace one set. He has to deal with or confront or challenge one set of feelings, Christian feelings, right? Which he describes in various places. You know, the morbid voluptuousness in their seeking of suffering, and in their imagination of the suffering of others, especially sinners, or this ravenous and desperate and sickly way that their desires of the flesh remain secret. So, you know, in addition to all these sort of wretched self-complacency feelings, right, there's all these sort of sick feelings within the soul, right? And so, and I bring all that up, even though it's kind of a tangential point, because it's what lies beneath the outward superficial skin of the self-consciousness. It's what lies beneath in the world of the passions and the unconscious self that really matters to Nietzsche. It's the matters of the heart over mind, we'll say, body over mind, right? And so it's really important for Nietzsche to contrast not just the dogmas or doctrines, but the underlying feelings. And so a lot of the problem is that the Christian heart is sick. The feelings beneath the Christian dogmas and ideals are sick and self-undermining. And, that's his problem with the whole Christian way of being. And so here, he's in some sense offering an alternative, but he's if we want to look at it in terms of those contrasts, but he's showing, I think, trying to give us a beautiful, healthy picture of the kind of inner life that he wants to spiritualize and wants to elevate. And it appears in the only language that it can appear, because he is now in the world of poetry, right? In the world of the unconscious self of the heart, the world of the heart. And so he speaks of it in the language of an encounter with a god, in a devotional poem for a god, communion with a deity that represents all of the things opposite the weakness of Christian feeling. And so, how does Nietzsche describe Dionysus in the opening lines of the prose poem? As, quote, the tempter god and born Pied Piper of consciences, whose voice knows how to descend into the netherworld of every soul, end quote. So throughout Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche says that one possible name for the free spirit, also known as the philosophers of the future, he says these are the people he sees following in his footsteps. Although seeking their own way, all the same. So maybe we shouldn't say following in his footsteps, because Nietzsche didn't like that sort of thing. He didn't want to have disciples himself. But he says one possible name for the free spirit will be tempters. Kaufman notes there's a play on words there. The connotation of the word in German, a tempter, is that of an experimenter, but there's an underlying implication of also being tempters. So, and Nietzsche says in the passage, the word itself, tempters, the very act of trying to describe or name the philosophers of the future, is itself only an attempt, and adds, it could also be a temptation. So, in his following sentence, where he names the free spirits as the tempters, he teases out the two meanings he's playing at: experimenting, but also seducing. And we can take this in the sense of the seductive power of knowledge, perhaps the serpent among Zarathustra's eagle and serpent represent, right? The seductive power of knowledge, that sort of an idea that goes all the way back to the Genesis story in Western culture. And then also, just the way in which those who experiment learn things which make possible other insights in the future. And that serves as a kind of inspiration for others to follow in their footsteps. So by experimenting oneself, one entices others to, follow after. But there's also, we should really take also the more perhaps dangerous implications of the word tempter. We don't have to limit this sort of interpretation to the world of knowledge. We could take it into the moral realm. What if there are moral experiments, right? Experiments one could carry out in one's own life to, say, adopt a certain way of living, or to regard certain things as right or wrong upon one's own table of values and act upon those principles, such that one avoids certain activities or behaviors. I mean, people experiment with themselves all the time. I mean, I could say, for example, that when I was a Buddhist, I was simply experimenting with the morality of Buddhism and trying to as closely approximate that morality in my own life and see the extent to which it actually changed my life. So you could call that a sort of moral experiment. And so, obviously, if somebody has a firm conviction that a certain morality is absolute, you might regard such a thing as moral experimentation to be inherently evil, right? And so there is, in some sense, people who grow up in places where there are very firm moral convictions eventually experiment with that morality and see if it really is, and they're told not to do so, right? Because that experiment is its own form of temptation, right? And so it's very interesting how the double meaning kind of exists in English. Not double meaning, but the implications are there as well, but without maybe the double entendre. But, I mean, people used to say, for example, that they'd experimented with drugs in college or what have you. That was the idiom. It was an experiment, right? So when Bill Clinton smoked weed and he didn't inhale, that was an experiment. And when George W. Bush snorted cocaine and did inhale, that was also an experiment. But people seem more open now about just coming out and saying that, when you're young, you party. It's not really an experiment. But on the other hand, I guess what I'm arguing here is that there is a sense in which it is. You might have to find out for yourself that getting hammered every single night of the week while trying to balance your college coursework will absolutely ruin you and make you feel like shit all the time. You might actually have to learn that lesson the hard way in order to learn how to moderate things like alcohol, or maybe even learn that alcohol isn't for you. But, if you grow up in a Mormon family or a Sunni Muslim family or an East Asian Buddhist family, they'll probably tell you, if you're raised in a culture like that no, you really shouldn't experiment with drinking. Not to speak of like heavy drinking. At any point in your life, we've already figured out the proper amount of alcohol for people to have, which is 0. It's a bad drug. It'll cause you problems. It'll make you act foolishly or heedlessly, or maybe it'll even endanger your soul, right? There's no experimentation needed. And so I think that helps establish how there's an inherent evil and seduction in experimentation that Nietzsche is getting at here. And I bring all this up, so on the word in German, I haven't said it actually, it's Versucher. The spirit, so in some sense that's the way he talks about Dionysus, the spirit of tempting and experimentation. It's the kind of mindset that leads you away from the flock, the Christian flock, or the Islamic or Buddhist flock for that matter. And that's also why then Nietzsche goes on to say that this spirit is a Pied Piper of consciences. The Pied Piper, of course, being the famous figure of legend who went through the streets of Hamelin playing his pipe, wearing pied clothes, which means multicolored clothing, and all of the children, dancing along to his music as he went throughout the town. They gathered behind him, and they follow him on his way out of town. It's what the genius of the heart does, through his willingness to explore or adventure into the deep questions, or to experiment, to uncover truths about morality, or to uncover, moral truths about oneself. The genius of the heart entices others to follow him in doing this. And to lose themselves, I really love the image because it's like lose yourself in a childlike dance in a procession. Gather up all these wayward, wandering souls and lead them on. Give them a quest. Give them a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal, as Nietzsche puts it in The Antichrist. And so the tempter god is the master of descending into the netherworld of every soul, he writes. That's what it means to be a Pied Piper of consciences, to descend into the depths, into the hinterland, the underworld, the unconscious side of the self that we've been talking about. And it's very good that he uses a musical metaphor, because music is a thing that touches the heart. It motivates movement. It stirs us to dance. And that's what the Pied Piper does. And so remember in Nietzsche's essays, the only knowledge that's of any concern to him is the knowledge that quickens action. So he writes in Use and Abuse of History for Life, which is to say guides, instructs, facilitates action, makes action possible. So this is the god Dionysus, as he describes him. He uses his aesthetic power to descend into your soul, into the underworld of your soul, and stirs something within you that gets you moving again. Right? And then in Nietzsche, in the lines that round out the first stanza, so to speak, I formulated it as a stanza in my notes, even though it's not really an actual stanza. He says that Dionysus, this great tempter god, is so enticing to our hearts, his presence is almost like a constraint upon us. We're bound by our enrapturement with him to seek out deeper and deeper longings, to follow this god of longing, seeking, temptation, more inwardly and more thoroughly, to let Dionysus dominate our entire state of mind. That's the power of the God that Nietzsche worships, and it's exactly, again, the way that the Greeks would think of artistic spirit possession. But again, the content, I think, is very, very interesting here, because he's presenting, again, a beautiful image of The spiritualization of feelings of desire, worldly desire. Desire, and not just in a vulgar sense either. I think it's key. There's hardly anything vulgar or about like recklessly abandoning yourself to hedonism or anything, which is how Dionysus is usually portrayed. There's nothing about that in this poem, really. Let's move on to let's look at the second stanza. I'll read that again in full. Quote, "The genius of the heart, who silences all that is loud and self-satisfied, teaching it to listen, who smooths rough souls and lets them taste a new desire, to lie still as a mirror, that the deep sky may mirror itself in them." End quote. So we can perhaps draw a parallel to Nietzsche's account of his own life in Ecce Homo, where he says that even the coarsest students were star pupils in his class. And he made even the class clowns, effortlessly he made the class clowns behave themselves, right? And the reason why is that Nietzsche says he's able to bring forth a more beautiful song, to make people, quote, sing more beautifully, end quote, than they ever have before. He compares the souls of others to sort of musical instruments. And Nietzsche, the professor, like a master musician, can pick up any of them and pluck on their strings and make them sound beautiful tones that they didn't even know they could sound. And so, later in the poem, in the fourth stanza, we have that line again describing the genius of the heart, quote, from whose touch everyone walks away richer, end quote. And then in the third stanza, he talks about he's like a divining rod for every grain of gold, buried in the muck, the greatness in you, the potential, hidden in the jungle of the unconsciousness and all of its messiness. When he speaks of this force, the genius of the heart, smoothing rough souls so that they can taste of a new desire, I think to some extent he's drawing on his personal experience. It's something he knows well because it's something that was part of his life. And the new desire that such rough souls can learn to appreciate, he actually clarifies, is to lie still as a mirror, reflecting the deep sky which mirrors itself in you. So we might conjure up the image of a clear, still lake mirroring the sky. That is, to use one's ability for self-reflection in order to sort of take in the majesty, the grandeur of what is signified by the heavens above, the realm where we once imagined gods and heroes, up in the constellations, that which is above and beyond humanity. So the strumming of beautiful tones from the souls of others, which is what the genius of the heart does, allows them to taste a new desire, and that new desire is for that which is above and beyond ourselves as we are now. That is his great gift for mankind. This speaks again to what Nietzsche believes should be conceived of as virtue or as greatness. The most overflowing souls have the most to give. And it's like their nobility comes through their generosity, with their love of life, through their natural radiance and fullness. They like awaken things in others. They act as a midwife for the greatness of others. That's how Nietzsche sees Dionysus. And he records in Ecce Homo that he tried and succeeded in living up to this image of a sort of spiritual generosity, we might say. And notice that the genius of the heart silences what's, quote, loud and self-satisfied. Self-satisfied is a great translation for it. On first glance, you might simply take this as like a condemnation of individual pride. But again, we should bring to mind the refrain in Zarathustra's prologue, where he keeps rejecting things as poverty, corruption, and wretched self-complacency. And so self-satisfaction, self-complacency, they're different ways of saying the same thing. The loudest voice within ourselves is always the voice of self-love, as La Rochefoucauld was keen to point out in his psychological and moral maxims. Our vanity compels us to affirm ourselves the way we are now. And in fact, our whole culture, narcissistic as it has become, has made it a mantra. You're just fine the way you are. This is the loud voice that Dionysus has to silence in order to make his presence known within the spirit. It's a loud, oppressive cacophony such that you can't hear the beautiful tones that he's trying to bring out, right? So you have to get over your self-complacency in order to be willing to let yourself, as you are now, go under and bring forth something new. something beyond what you are now. As much as I may employ the language of danger and adventure to sell the idea that Nietzsche is conveying in the poem, we should also note that throughout the stanzas there's like a sense of gentleness, of softness. Maybe the correct term would be care, in the sense of taking care, not being careless, and but also in the sense of caring, being caring towards others, but also finding actual meaning and significance. So he says the genius of the heart will make the doltish learn to hesitate. Hesitation is taking heed. That's still a virtue. It'll teach us to reach out more delicately. And for what? Well, the secret forgotten treasure that he describes as a drop of graciousness and sweet spirituality under dim and thick ice. It seems that's one of the aspects of this that he's trying to instill in us: more softness, more care, more grace. You know, something that comes to mind, actually, that I think I could put a lot of the underlying meaning to that aspect of this poem as simply as Radiohead does in the song "The Tourist." And the chorus is, "Hey man, slow down, idiot, slow down." That's a song that Tom York described as being about seeing tourists dashing about, like in Paris, I think. It might have been another city. I don't remember. We'll use Paris for this example. You know, tourists are running around trying to see every attraction that they can, get in every experience they can. So they hardly have time to enjoy the experience while it's happening. And the minute they get to the attraction, say the Eiffel Tower, they see it. They spend the appropriate amount of time, but they don't ever slow down enough to forget about their rigorous sightseeing schedule. That's the haste of that thing is what's dominating their mind. It's always in the back of their mind. And so there's something really to be said for having nothing else to do in an afternoon and be able to spend as much time as you want in a place and just immerse yourself and savor it. But, and the Italians, they're pretty damn good at this, by the way, from the Italians I've met. But maybe except for the Italians, we're all tourists in this world, right? We're only here temporarily. You get 70 short years on this planet, if you're lucky. 100 if you're really lucky. You know, actually, for many people, it's a lot less. We get a short tour of the world, and then we go back to the soil. And so Nietzsche is drawing attention to the value of slowing down for a moment on this tour of existence, fully immerse oneself in one's experience. And so, he says when we receive this blessing, one comes away richer in himself, newer to himself than before. And so I think you can have that level of care or caring or immersion when things feel new, truly new, and with that sort of childlike newness, right? He's talking about there's a definite rebirth, rekindling of life theme throughout this passage. That seeing the world with that new eyes of childlike innocence makes it more beautiful to you, maybe than it was. Maybe the same setting would be more beautiful to you than it was before. As a result of the encounter with this God, we may find ourselves, quote, perhaps more unsure, tenderer, more fragile, more broken, but full of hopes that as yet have no name, full of new will and currents, a new dissatisfaction and undertow, end quote. So we have the beauty and terror that Nietzsche has attempted to convey in order to sort of sing the majesty of this tempter god that is likely to break us, smash us down to dust, so that we can live again. And more fragile, more broken, but this is presented as a new beginning, right? This sort of, what does he say, a thawing wind, right? I'm reminded, again, I'm just making references all over Nietzsche's work here, but to the reference to Saint Januarius in Book 4 of the Gay Science, basically implying Nietzsche feels that his blood has become liquid again, just like the saint's blood becomes liquid on his feast day. I think we should refer back to the aspect I mentioned before about language, which we got in that passage I talked about last week, the genius of the species. The most personal feelings, the most complex and profound instincts remain ours alone. that our actions are individually unique to the highest degree, but putting the deep currents and will of our psyche into linguistic concepts forces us to draw on mind images or symbols whose meaning has to be made average. It has to be understood by the many in order to find usefulness as a word. And so our deepest feelings have to exist in an untranslatable form, outside even of philosophical reflection or even of rational understanding. And so I think this is why he's talking about hopes that as yet have no name. In this feeling of dissatisfaction, this longing for something that we cannot quite put into words. And you could argue a lot of Nietzsche's career involves putting things into words that maybe should not be put into words. And that's why he worries about being misunderstood or mistaken. And as for this feeling of distraction, one might be inclined to say that it sounds like a bad thing, that this sounds like a curse, that the god Nietzsche worships is a Schopenhauerian nightmare who instills an unfulfillable longing within us. But I don't think Nietzsche sees it that way. I think in many respects he agrees with Schopenhauer's view of how the world works, but he thinks it's a very powerful and healthy thing that continually drives us. And this great contempt, this great dissatisfaction with ourselves, which is the opposite of self-complacency, it's the very character, the very nature of life. And this is why Dionysus is a god of life, right? A god that Nietzsche sees as expressing and demanding the pursuit of the fullness of life. So he's overgenerous in that way because it's a great gift. That's why we all walk away richer from our encounters with him, because we perceive something within ourselves, something gleaming or golden or precious. It's the shimmer of something that might one day become a star, or the spark that one day might ignite a destructive fire. And so in his own commentary that kind of follows the poem, the way I'm sort of thinking about this, by the way, I think he goes into a more regular style of prose after he asks, but what am I doing, my friends? And then there's sort of the section, the paragraph where he identifies that the genius of the heart is Dionysus. He begins by saying in this sort of commentary section that he's been a stranger and a wanderer in foreign parts. His whole life, Nietzsche confesses to us, he's always felt just like a passerby, never feeling fully at home anywhere he goes, never feeling like he was truly anyone's compatriot. And so for this type of person, one like himself, he says, the genius of the heart, who is Dionysus, he speaks of it in universal terms. He says it's bound to be a spirit that what such a one will encounter. The solitary life is a life of longing. It's the kind of life that draws taut the bow of the soul, so to speak, right? When Nietzsche therefore says, quote, Dionysus is a philosopher, and, quote, gods too do philosophy, we might call to mind that Nietzsche says that every impulse has its own form of reason. Or to speak more generally, that reason's not something which is limited to the activities of consciousness. The world of the unconscious is a world in which reason exists, and we can say that reason exists in any form in which a value exists. That is to say, a valuation, a judgment of something's worth, and in which problem solving occurs in order to either obtain what has worth or to destroy or flee from what's harmful, or like flee from that which has negative worth, right? And so our passions, on the other hand, like what Jung called the nighttime half of the psyche, the unconscious self, they all have their own reason, and they employ reason for their own ends. And that's the vast majority of the thinking that we do. Nietzsche's strange conviction is that we think without even being aware of it. We feel and think things that never enter into the mirror of consciousness. We act for reasons which are at the time unknown to us. And that's the majority of human thought and intellectual life. A small minority of it comes into the consciousness. And so, like all the other passions or gods or spirits or archetypes, whatever you want to call the inner contents of the psyche, Dionysus has his form of reason, which means he does philosophy. All the gods, all the strong passions have their own philosophy. So Nietzsche says that the philosophers won't want to accept this, and of course they won't, because such a thing might imply that their own philosophy was not the product of their consciousness, but something that came out of that swirling roil of unconsciousness. That their philosophy is simply another form of artistic expression, which is to say that it's a product, in the Greek view, of divine inspiration, of spirit possession, something issued from the hand of a muse, not the philosopher himself. At least if the philosopher's intent on clinging to the view of the self that's synonymous with the subjective experience of the ego consciousness. If we take a broader view of the self that includes the unconsciousness, we can say it still comes from ourselves. But, by the way, this is exactly what Nietzsche charges earlier in the book, as he writes way back in the first chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, that every philosophy is an involuntary and unconscious memoir of its author, a confession of their own moral or immoral aims which the philosophy is meant to serve. And so that would mean the explanations for why we do philosophy, which enter our consciousness, are but another product of vanity or of self-love. Our conscious explanations for our actions, here as elsewhere, are a commentary on an unknown text, as Nietzsche calls it in Daybreak, which fits in nicely to the idea that it's actually a muse philosophizing, right? The true writer of the philosophy is one's inner muse, whoever it may be. The impetus from the philosophy comes from the muse, and so the text itself is unknown to our conscious life. We only know of the philosophy, our internal, our deep, our unconscious philosophy, which breaches the surface of consciousness and forms itself into words. And this is, since I brought up Jung, the same way that Jung described the psyche, saying we should not say, quote, I had a thought, or, quote, I had a feeling, I have a pathology, but rather a thought, a feeling, a pathology has me. That we're a vessel for multiple gods or spirits which occasionally take the helm of the self in their turn. And when a god is guiding our hand, it acts according to its own philosophy. But Nietzsche then, of course, addresses the elephant in the room. Quote, among you, my friends, it will not seem so offensive unless it comes too late, and not at the right moment, for today, as I have been told, you no longer like to believe in God and gods. End quote. And so it's too late. All of you can no longer believe in Dionysus as a god. It's not the right moment for Nietzsche to try and reawaken some pagan mystery cult. So is the task that Nietzsche has set for himself impossible? Can such a thing as a renewed celebration of Dionysus even happen? Could we maybe recreate a god? Well, this is where it's problematic because, famously Zarathustra says you could not create a god, right? So don't speak of any gods. But you could create the Übermensch. I think there is, to some extent at least, a distinction we could make. That Nietzsche's not suggesting we create Dionysus out of whole cloth. Again, Dionysus, as he speaks of him here, is a reflection. He's a reflection of Nietzsche in some sense. Dionysus is here presented in a way that he does tie back to the Dionysus of Greek tradition, but he is sort of something that Nietzsche is using the raw material of himself to produce. But that right there, I think, kind of hints at maybe what Nietzsche is wondering if he can accomplish, because I think Dionysus, the name that he's given for this, what we call it, the longing complex in mankind, right? He's saying it's something that's always lived in man's soul. It's something Nietzsche discovered and didn't create out of whole cloth. And he discovered it in himself, and he expresses it within his own words because Dionysus is still alive in Nietzsche. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to this, whether we could it's the kind of silly question I often ask. I asked Carl this in my conversation with him about whether we could create a new Dionysian religion. He was like, I don't want to even go there. He's like, you're playing with fire. But another funny thing here is that even though Jordan Peterson always says Nietzsche didn't understand that he couldn't create values, in Zarathustra, Zarathustra says that to create values is to discover them. And we have here, yet again, Nietzsche's not saying he can arbitrarily, produce a value system divorced from the inner psyche of humanity as it actually exists and like make us conform to this alien value system. He stresses that Dionysus is not an alien entity. It's something within you, right? So he would say it's not creation of values ex nihilo, just like he's not trying to create this religious image ex nihilo. He's identifying something that's been in the human heart forever, or else it wouldn't speak so strongly, right? It's been nurtured in some ages and neglected in others, and in our age it's been particularly neglected, even suppressed, right? But it's still there, and it speaks very strongly to Nietzsche, for a variety of factors that he feels it's from a variety of factors involving like his solitude and this, that, and the other. But so another way of saying it is, what would you call it? A natural, healthy celebration of desire. And it's like a shameless desire for life and living. Desire for total honesty in one's desires, right? Which involves the freedom of one's words matching their actions. Their actions to therefore be enacted freely. And so this is like a yearning for freedom. Freedom in the sense of living out one's passions. And what that then therefore entails is a love of being human, and a love therefore for all that which is human. Because to be human is to be a desiring being a creature with the ability to transform the world and to transform itself, to give rise to things beyond itself and so on. To love all that and accept that calling in life. And as Dionysus utters, quote, "I have no reason for covering my nakedness." So Dionysus is without the shame felt by Adam and Eve, right? Famously. Dionysus, the genius of the heart, is the shameless longing for life we naturally felt until the feeling of sin and thus shame in our own bodies was beaten into us. And so it's rediscovery of natural innocence. Being shameless about following your desires, right? That always puts an element of evil or wickedness onto Dionysus. I'll read again perhaps my favorite part of the passage, Dionysus's vision for mankind. And so this section, quote, "Man to my mind is an agreeable, courageous, inventive animal that has no equal on earth. It finds its way in any labyrinth. I am well disposed towards him. I often reflect how I might yet advance him and make him stronger, more evil, and more profound than he is." "Stronger evil and more profound?" I asked, startled. "Yes," he said once more, "stronger, more evil, and more profound, and also more beautiful," end quote. And so naturally, if nature has been made evil, then shamelessness in the face of our own nature is evil. And so to rediscover this natural innocence, this natural shamelessness, is therefore evil. And it's the danger we described before, the danger of experimenting, which again, people do when they're young, when they're either innocent children who don't know the rules yet, or, when you're teenagers or you're in college and you haven't had usually the full weight of like worldly consequences visited upon you, right? That teach you not to stray from the bounds of the morality. You're more innocent than you are later in life. And it was a moral experiment of Eve's to try the apple, see what the knowledge of good and evil really was. You could say, to test God. And note the dictate of Christianity, "Thou shalt not test the Lord thy God." It's a sin to be an experimenter. And so we have to lose the memory of things like sin in order to experiment again and be childlike again, like Adam and Eve were before they were cursed by sin in the first place. But unlike the Genesis version of the human condition, Nietzsche, I think, is broader. The way he sees the world is more akin to the way Heraclitus describes the world. We live in this reality which is more like an ever-living fire. It's all dynamic. it's always shifting and becoming. It's never static, or there's no duration is an illusion. And so there's an element of that too. The passage in Heraclitus of children, innocent children playing. They build sandcastles, knock them down, they create and destroy without any moral baggage attached to those actions. They do so with childish innocence and a totally clean conscience, a conscience that's unburdened, right? An empty conscience. And so that's the true character of man, in some sense. That's the natural type of man that Dionysus loves, that he pays his compliments to. He gestures towards Ariadne. That's who he pays his compliments to. Ariadne, there's been quite a lot of interpretations of Nietzsche and his view on Ariadne. Ariadne is sort of, it's interesting. It's like a male. We would have to get into like Nietzsche's view. Maybe I will have to talk about Nietzsche and women, because he talks about masculinity and femininity in a very specific way. And we've talked about it a little bit on the episode on how truth is a woman. But Dionysus and Ariadne, they are lovers in Greek myth. One is a god, Dionysus, the other's human, Ariadne. So there is, you can kind of get the obvious like sexual metaphor there, that Dionysus is the giver and she is the receiver, right? So he, again, from everything we've talked about, he's like the god that inhabits within her, right? But I guess that raises like, why Ariadne, and then what's Ariadne's place? Why does Nietzsche become enamored with Ariadne? Ariadne is sort of the stand-in for, I guess, man's ability to receive, to be receptive to the genius of the heart. And the reason why Ariadne, she's the one who finds her way out of the labyrinth, right? And to some extent, that's how Nietzsche sees himself, as and it's a way that he often talks about as a metaphor for the human condition, right? But that's his trials in life, is to find his way out of these labyrinths of the mind, these or of the heart. The references to Ariadne, for the purposes of this episode, maybe I'll do a whole episode on Ariadne and the role of like male and female in Nietzsche's philosophy. But Ariadne is his it's the avatar for the human finding their way out of the labyrinth. And that's who Dionysus praises as for her humanity, right? And Nietzsche says at sort of the conclusion of the passage that even the gods can learn a thing or two from us humans. We humans are more humane, right? This is a hint again. Dionysus, the genius of the heart, is a potential within each of us, within our own hearts. But there is something like single-minded and amoral and capricious about gods in the Greek sense, and in the metaphorical sense in which a god could stand for a passion or a complex of passions. And so Dionysus, as a god, loves what's human and affirms what's human, even when it's evil to do so, even when it's the evil aspects of humanity. He accepts it and embraces it. I think the last lines are almost a caveat, right? That don't let this consume you, and like don't fully identify with this archetype to where it possesses you entirely, because otherwise that is to stop being human, right? We humans are more humane. We don't say humane so much, except when we're talking about like human rights abuses and shit and modern English. But we still have an idiom of like, when you tell someone you're a real human being, or you've been a human being about this, it's like a compliment, or or the way someone is called a Mensch. In fact, if we just look at the last sentence in German, wir Menschen sind menschlicher. We humans are more human-like. And so, maybe a more straightforward way of saying it is Dionysus, as the god of the celebration of being human, can learn a thing or two from us humans, obviously. Another point of interest in this entire meditation on Dionysus. If we skip back a bit to where Nietzsche says that he sacrificed his firstborn, I mean, Nietzsche obviously didn't have children. So who is the firstborn? Well, Nietzsche's legacy, it's not biological children, but it's in ideas. It's his works. It's his books. And his first book is Birth of Tragedy, which famously concerns the opposition and the creative dance between Apollo and Dionysus, the two artistic forces which Nietzsche says existed in the Greek soul. These are the two forces that give rise to dramatic tragedy. And so it must be said here, the Dionysus of that era is not the Dionysus that Nietzsche is addressing here in some sense. Or the way that he talks about Dionysus in that particular book. It's probably a little closer to Nietzsche talking about the historical Dionysus as he was conceived of by the Greeks than by the Dionysus he's talking to in this section, who is the genius of the heart, the spirit of longing in everyone. Because in that book, in Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche is solely concerned with Dionysus and Apollo as they exist within the world of art, well, specifically in Greek dramatic tragedy. He's not making the claim these are like universal metaphysical forces, or that Apollo or Dionysus, he doesn't make claims about them applying to the political or ethical realm or as general psychological principles. He talks about them as culturally specific deities, which represent the Greek understanding of what are nevertheless two universal concepts, right? Individuation in Apollo's case and dissolution in Dionysus's case. And so while we can learn from the Greek culture in ways that can enrich our own, he nevertheless is sort of limited in what he's talking about. He's talking about Dionysus as the dissolving effect that's carried on the medium of music, or which exists in alcohol's power for intoxication. And so specifically, that the Greeks use both in concert, and so what he represents is dissolution of the self through ritual, drunken revelry. And so, it's with the expansion of the concept of Dionysus into other spheres or other aspects of the psyche. As Nietzsche continues with that process, Dionysus very quickly sheds Apollo as his opposer. What Nietzsche saw within the Dionysian artistic force back in Birth of Tragedy, one of those insights that he could apply universally, was that the ritualized emergence of this state of dissolution was a sort of return to animal mindlessness that served a social utility. Why? It's a big question, because if it serves some social utility, that would imply that humanity has a need or a drive to return to the lack of self-consciousness, to return to a lack of historical understanding. The lack of historical understanding that characterizes animal life, right? Animals who just mindlessly engage in impulse fulfillment. And so, and dancing wildly and shouting, and like the Maenads did, more deer than women, their throats turned toward the stars, drunkenly dancing about. That's, I'm stealing from Donna Tartt there. But it's losing yourself, right? So what could this mean? That there's a need to lose oneself, to get rid of the pain of being a man and cleave back to this primordial oneness. Now that we've expanded Dionysus in his later work to have a much less specific meaning, that showed him, I think, this longing for something, and that it was a longing for something that was based on a return to an animal innocence, as we've been putting it, right? And so why are we so disconnected from that? Well, he first lays the blame at the feet of Socrates in that very work. The hyper-rationalist philosopher who wishes to banish the Dionysian from public life. Right? Self-forgetting is the opposite of the Socratic project. Socrates wishes us to know ourselves. We have to know ourselves if we're to become virtuous, right? That's the goal of his whole philosophy, is virtue. So there's a lot that's admirable in Socrates. Nietzsche calls him the first philosopher of life, after all. And his reason for wishing to suppress the Dionysian is because of its destructive power, which very much exists. And He has to then therefore suppress that self-forgetting force for the sake of virtue, which is a laudable goal. Nietzsche, of course, still has very serious problems with Socrates, particularly in the martyrdom of Socrates, dying for the sake of the truth. But Socrates is a figure for whom he has too many complicated feelings, too much reverence and respect for him to really be the ultimate villain of Nietzsche's philosophy, right? Because of his lack of a sense of the Dionysian, he's totally inartistic, right? Socrates, he's hostile to art. But Nietzsche sees that as like an inherent flaw in Socrates. And I've mentioned it before, but in some sense that becomes Nietzsche's own project to wonder if an artistic Socrates is possible. Some of the reverence for Socrates might even be apparent in this same passage then, the genius of the heart, insofar as the way that he describes Dionysus can potentially apply to Socrates. The fencing master of Athens who defeated his opponents in the domain of logical combat. He left them more broken, he left them more fragile, but perhaps having stirred a new will within them, a new dissatisfaction with what they before regarded with complacency. So we can see the ways in which the language Nietzsche uses could apply to Socrates. Socrates is something of a genius of the heart in his own way. And here's a quote from Socrates in Theaetetus, quote, "For that and no more is all that my art can effect, nor have I any of that knowledge by all the great and admirable men of our own day or of the past. But this midwife's art is a gift from heaven. My mother had it for women, and I for young men of a generous spirit, and for all in whom beauty dwells." End quote. And so Socrates comes out and said it. He says that that's his art, that he practices the midwife's art of bringing something beautiful out of those in whom it dwells. And, as being a generous spirit, Socrates says that those who are made barren in their thoughts are made gentler elsewhere in the passage. And in other words, he humbles those whom he bests in intellectual combat, and, by disabusing them of their ideas, which are not really more than prejudices. And so the fact that Socrates could be compared to the genius of the heart reveals yet another way in which Dionysus evolved from the conception presented in Birth of Tragedy. And as we've already covered, the opposition eventually becomes one of Dionysus not against Socrates, but against Christ. Rather than signifying chaotic, frenzied impulses, though, as he does in Birth of Tragedy, Dionysus comes to symbolize the regaining of this lost connection with our passions, such that since we live in alienation from ourselves and willfully suppress our own passions, it's for this reason that we feel rent asunder and internally chaotic, and that, in a way, the truly passionate person, the healthy, passionate person, will be, like the Greek nobles of old, not a chaotic spirit, but a sort of the truly passionate person is a master of their own passions. And so in Nietzsche's later work, even somebody like Goethe can be called Dionysian, as Nietzsche calls him Dionysian in Twilight of Idols. So Dionysus is a renewed shamelessness at embracing what is human and knowing the passions. And that gives you a leg to stand on, a position from which you can begin to order the passions and become a master of yourself, or give style to your character, as he says elsewhere. And so, to speak mythologically again, that's what Dionysus wants for us. That's how the genius of the heart blesses us. And so this portrait of Dionysus, it is what Nietzsche aspired to be, but it is, I think, what he hopes his Dionysian religion will eventually unleash on the world. And the end result is this overfullness, a richness of life that makes you want to give and give. That becomes your great need. The desire to share your wealth, a wish to share your love of life with others. And this is, if we'll remember, exactly the sentiment of Zarathustra, who's the prophet of the Dionysian religion. It's at the very start of his prologue, in that scene that first appears in the Gay Science. Zarathustra praises the sun. climbing into the sky every day to give its golden rays freely to the world. And he says that he has become overfull. Zarathustra says he wishes to give away himself, to squander his wealth, to go down and go under and be a man again after giving himself away to others. That's also the sentiment of the poem on the poverty of the richest. Nietzsche confessing his own great need that he felt within him to share his inner richness, to give himself up to the world, So we'll wrap it up here. I mean, you probably know I've referenced it at least once before. Charlie Huneman, professor in Utah, he has a self-published book on Nietzsche, which is very good, but it's called Genius of the Heart. So it's named after this particular aphorism or prose poem. And I had only read his essay, Nietzsche's Task, when I first started doing the podcast, but I read Genius of the Heart shortly after I started. And so I really only read this book like a year ago for the first time, and so I've been looking through it again. And I feel like I can't end the analysis of this passage without at least touching on what Huneman says about it, because after all, he named his book after this passage. And I think Huneman is correct that this poem says something central about Nietzsche's philosophical project. And so he points out on page 29 of his book, and I'll quote him here, quote, Nietzsche never offered a recipe for becoming his ideal, but at one point he does describe the kind of teacher who can help us to become who we are. He called this person the genius of the heart, end quote. So obviously Huneman sees this less as an actual God possessing a person and as an ideal for the kind of teacher Nietzsche wants to be and wants others to be, which is a perfectly fine interpretation, by the way. So he goes on to clarify something very important. Quote, Nietzsche did not strive to be an Übermensch so much as the one who entices himself and others toward greater strength and health, end quote. And skipping now to page 31, I'm going to read one more segment of Huneman's work here in an abridged form. Quote, anyone nourished by such a genius of the heart may have full health in the Nietzschean sense. Nothing can harm them, since they accept even the harshest experiences as opportunities for growth and self-mastery. They are thankful for their enemies and for the attacks they suffer, since these will only serve to make them stronger. They have the strength and knowledge to see that the good versus evil distinction has arisen through psychological failings of humans over time, and they are capable of living beyond good and evil. What dictates their actions is a sense of their own nobility, along with a wisdom about what human beings most deeply need and what makes them stronger. They exist beyond men, and yet alongside them as their cultivators, end quote. And so we can understand Huneman's interpretation this way, which is another way of saying what I've been saying throughout this whole episode. We can tie Huneman's understanding back to the types of the artist, saint, and philosopher. Remember, those are the three figures Nietzsche gives in his early essay for the one leap that nature makes from animal to man. These are the three images that man has produced that show away from the world of blind impulse fulfillment to something beyond that, either through, inner cruelty of ascetic discipline, or through expansion of conscious reflection, or through the ability to redirect or cut off feelings and emotional states. None of these images is without its flaw, however. The saint leads mankind's will beyond the blind impulses, but the saint leads them off into nothingness. He leads them to seek after nothingness. That's the image of Jesus and Gautama Buddha and the Christian martyrs and so on. The artist promises to shape our inner life, but the artist works through deception, through illusion, through incompleteness. That's Goethe, Shakespeare, and so on. The artist is ultimately prone to folly, owing to the fact that he falsifies reality, however great of a figure he may be. And the philosopher, who's perhaps the figure about which Nietzsche is most conflicted, is both powerful and dangerous. The highest image of the philosopher is perhaps Socrates, which illustrates the depth of the problem, as Nietzsche finds it, the great power of science, and the destructive potency of skeptical truth-seeking, the sacrifice of life at the altar of truth. And so here, if we were to take this as just an image of how to live, it's the invention of a new type, the genius of the heart. And Nietzsche finds a satisfactory answer to his question, what shall man's ideal be? What image shall we model ourselves after? And this is Nietzsche's contribution, the Dionysian. That's the means of elevating mankind, of justifying, redeeming, and spiritualizing our lives. The higher man is not the man who cuts off the flesh such that the flesh won't sin. He is an artist in a sense, but without the artist's dishonesty, right? He's the kind of artist who wants to only work through complete, shameless honesty, a true meeting of souls. And he is a philosopher in the way that even the gods do their own philosophy, but not in the way Socrates does it. Maybe the way that an artistic Socrates would do philosophy, we might say. And so, in a way, the passage we've discussed, it's a poetic statement of a new ethos, a new table of values. It tells us what it is to embody the genius of the heart, to be a tempter and in a tempter, to be in touch with your inner feelings, and shameless in regards to them, while nevertheless recognizing what is beautiful or what is ugly within oneself, what is gold and what is muck, we might say, and then therefore living in such a way to bring out the gold, to become stronger and more beautiful. That's the Dionysian path. Okay, I've run out of things to say about this poem. With that, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.